All right, everybody, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Always ready to dive in.
Awesome. Today we're tackling a big one, a really big one. Neoliberalism.
Yeah, it's one of those terms you hear everywhere.
Right, like in the news articles, online, all over the place.
But it can be kind of hard to pin down.
Exactly. Like, what does it actually mean?
Mm.
And is it still relevant today?
Well, that's what we're here to find out.
Exactly. So we've got a ton of research lined up here. Articles, reports, even some historical stuff.
Should be fascinating to see how it all connects.
Totally. So let's start with the basics. What is neoliberalism? Can you give us like the elevator pitch?
Sure. So, in a nutshell, neoliberalism is this economic philosophy that emphasizes free markets and minimal government intervention.
Okay, so like a hands-off approach from the government.
Exactly. The idea is that if you let markets operate freely with less regulation and government control, you'll see more efficiency, more innovation, and ultimately more economic growth.
Okay, I kind of get it, but can you give me like a real-world example?
Sure. Think about the airline industry in the U.S. back in the 70s and 80s. Before deregulation, the government pretty much controlled everything. Routes, fares, you name it.
Okay.
But with deregulation, suddenly you had all these new airlines popping up, competing with each other, offering lower prices and new routes.
So cheaper flights, more options. Sounds good so far.
Right, but there was a trade-off.
Uh-oh, what kind of trade-off?
Well, some argue that safety regulations and worker protections were also weakened as companies tried to cut costs and stay competitive.
Oh, I see. So it's not always a simple win-win situation.
Nope, definitely not.
Okay, so back to neoliberalism itself. It feels like this idea really took off in the late 20th century.
Absolutely. It became super influential in the 70s and 80s.
And there were some pretty big names associated with it,
Oh,
right?
yeah, definitely. Think Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Ronald Reagan in the US.
Right. They were huge proponents of these policies, weren't they?
Absolutely. They both implemented things like tax cuts, deregulation, and privatization programs, selling off government-owned companies and services.
Interesting. And their ideas were pretty popular back then, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. It was a big departure from the more socially focused policies of previous decades.
So this was a global trend,
Yeah.
not just limited to the US and UK.
Right. You also saw international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank encouraging developing countries to adopt similar free market policies.
Wow. So neoliberalism was really making waves around the world.
It was. Often these policies were tied to loans and aid packages, which gave these institutions a lot of influence.
Makes sense. Okay, but our research also mentions some major criticisms of neoliberalism. What were some of the downsides starting to emerge?
Well, one of the biggest concerns was rising inequality.
Yeah, that makes sense. If it's all about free markets and competition, wouldn't that naturally lead to some people getting ahead while others fall behind?
Exactly. Critics argued that while neoliberalism might boost economic growth overall, the benefits weren't being distributed evenly.
So you had a widening gap between the rich and poor.
Exactly. And that led to all sorts of social problems.
No,
Well, think about things like stagnant wages for the working class, the rising costs of housing, healthcare, education.
yeah, I can see how that would create a lot of tension and frustration.
Definitely. And it wasn't just about income inequality. There were also concerns about the erosion of public services.
How so?
Well, as governments embraced privatization, they started selling off state-owned assets like utilities, transportation systems, even parts of the healthcare and education systems.
What was the problem with that?
Well, critics argued that it led to higher costs, reduced access for low-income folks, and a decline in the quality of those services.
Okay, yeah, that's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when it comes to essential services like healthcare and education.
Absolutely. And then, of course, you have the 2008 financial crisis.
Right. That was a major turning point, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, think about it. Deregulation in the financial industry was a key part of the neoliberal playbook.
Right. The idea was to let markets do their thing right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it led to a lot of risky behavior, reckless lending, and ultimately a global financial meltdown.
Yeah, it really shook people's faith in the idea that markets could regulate themselves.
For sure. It was a wake-up call for a lot of people.
So how did things change after 2008?
Well, you definitely saw a shift in thinking. Governments started to realize that maybe a completely hands-off approach wasn't the best way to manage the economy.
Yeah, especially after having to bail out those big banks and corporations.
Exactly. It became clear that some level of regulation and oversight was necessary to prevent future crises.
And then came the pandemic.
Right. And that threw another wrench in the works.
Because suddenly governments had to intervene in the economy in a massive way, right?
Exactly. You had lockdowns, travel restrictions, businesses shutting down.
It was chaos.
It was. And governments had to step in with huge stimulus packages, social safety net programs, all sorts of interventions to try and stabilize things.
So was that the final nail in the coffin for neoliberalism?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. Some argue that we're witnessing the death of neoliberalism as we know it.
While others think it's just evolving.
Right. I mean, we're definitely seeing a resurgence of interest in more interventionist policies, a greater emphasis on social welfare, and a recognition that unfettered markets can lead to some pretty negative outcomes.
So where do we go from here? What's the future of economics?
That's the big question, isn't it? Some folks are calling for a return to more traditional Keynesian economics with a bigger role for government spending and regulation.
Others are pushing for more radical solutions like a universal basic income or a Green New Deal.
Right. There's a lot of debate happening right now about what the best path forward is.
Wow. So it sounds like neoliberalism might be on its way out, but we're still figuring out what comes next.
Exactly. It's a really interesting time to be thinking about these issues.
It is. So for our listeners out there who are trying to wrap their heads around all of this, what are some key takeaways they should keep in mind?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that neoliberalism has been a dominant force in global economics for decades, shaping policies and impacting lives around the world.
But it's a complex philosophy with both positive and negative consequences.
Exactly. It's important to understand both the potential benefits and the potential drawbacks of free markets and limited government intervention.
And we're at a crossroads now where those ideas are being challenged and new models are emerging.
So it's a time for critical thinking, thoughtful debate, and maybe even a little bit of optimism about the future of economics.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those questions coming, because the conversation about the economy is one that affects us all.
And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to come up with the next big idea that shapes the 21st century.
Hey, anything is possible.
That's the spirit.
All right, folks, that's our deep dive on neoliberalism. Thanks for tuning in.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.